Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm Jill, your host, and I'm super excited today to introduce you to Lara Dato. She is an occupational therapist who works with children, and she's the author of Raising Adventurous Eaters: Practical Ways to Overcome Picky Eating and Food Sensory Sensitivities. She also has a specialty certification in feeding, eating, and swallowing, and is one of approximately 50 professionals with these credentials in the United States. She also teaches courses on feeding therapy across the country, and her passion is helping picky eaters and their families find joy in adventurous eating. And that's exactly why I have her on the show today. Welcome to the show, Lara.
Thank you so much, Jill. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk about picky eating, which I've done a lot on this podcast. But as I mentioned to you before we got started, one of the things that I really like about your book that has come out, which is called Raising Adventurous Eaters: Practical Ways to Overcome Picky Eating and Food Sensory Sensitivities. One of the things I really liked about it was the food sensory sensitivities approach. But before we dive down all of the senses, tell us a little bit about how you got into occupational therapy and feeding, and sort of what your life looks like day to day.
Yeah, so I always knew that I wanted to work in healthcare. It was something I knew from really early on, but I actually hadn't heard about occupational therapy until I was in college, and I took a course on autism and was working with families and in schools with children with autism, and I loved every second of it. And I was like, this is what I want to do with my life, but was having a hard time finding a field in which I was going to be able to do that. And my wonderful grandmother actually set me up with someone. She was like, oh, I know someone that does that. I don't know what her job title is, but you can talk to her. And she was an OT. And from hearing about occupational therapy, I immediately fell in love with it and decided to pursue it really quickly. I became an occupational therapist, started working with children. And what I found as I was working as a more holistic OT was that so many of my patients had difficulty with eating. And it was sort of no matter what their primary diagnosis was, eating was really difficult. And when eating is difficult, that challenges everything else. Because if you're not eating well, you're not nourished, you're not sleeping well, it's hard to develop, it's hard to play, it's hard to have the energy that you need to do all the things that our energetic kids like to do. And so I found, wow, this is just so important. This is what I want to really dedicate my time to, and dove in head first. And now I am lucky enough that is what I get to do full time at work. I work in a children's hospital, working with children with all sorts of different feeding difficulties and helping them and their families find a lot of joy and pleasure out of eating.
That's great. That's great. And in your bio, you mentioned that you specialize in feeding, eating, and swallowing. And I think, when I think about swallowing, I think of a speech and language pathologist. So it's really interesting how you've sort of integrated the three things. What does that look like in terms of your practice?
Yeah, so the American Occupational Therapy Association has specialty certifications, and this is one that I have pursued and got, oh my goodness, I think almost 5 years ago now. Mm-hmm. And so really looking at eating, it is such a complex thing. It takes so many muscles. It takes all of our sensory systems, as you know, I'm really passionate about. There's a lot mechanically that needs to happen as well. There's a lot from a mental health perspective that needs to happen. And so when I'm approaching a family and a child that has difficulty with eating, I like to keep all of those things in mind. Make sure that mechanically everything is going well. From a safety perspective, everything is going down the way it needs to. And then looking more at how is this family and this child approaching this mealtime, this food, this interaction to make it as positive as we can.
Yeah. So, one of the things that, I've worked with picky eaters over the years, from sort of typically developing children to, non-typically developing children. And the sensory thing comes up all the time, especially for kids who might have what is sort of commonly referred to as extreme picky eating, or as we know as clinicians, ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And so many of those things rely on the senses, and sensory processing. So take us through, my audience here is mostly parents. So take us through what you mean by the senses and how those relate to eating. And then what does it mean about, how does that all tie into sensory processing?
Absolutely. So, first to start out with, we always think of our five senses, right? We have taste, touch, smell, hearing. And we have a couple others as well. We have our proprioceptive sense, which is our body awareness sense. That's how do we motor plan? How do we know where our body is in space? How do we know how all those muscles are working if we can't see them? Which comes in really important for like the tongue, because that's not something we can watch while we're eating. We have our vestibular system. That's our sense of balance. How are we sitting in the chair? Are we feeling centered and organized? And we have our interoception, which is our awareness of our internal body cues. So that's, are we hungry? Are we thirsty? Do we need to go to the bathroom? Is our heart racing? Awareness of all of those internal body systems. So those are our senses. And then for our sensory processing, what that really is how is our brain interpreting all of the information that we're getting from our environment? And how is it organizing it so that we can move forward with the information that we're getting from our environment? And what's tricky about food and eating is it really challenges every one of those senses. You're thinking about what the food smells like, what it tastes like, what it feels like in your mouth, what it sounds like when you're chewing, what that pressure and organization of the food in your mouth is, how you're balanced in your chair. Are you hungry? How do you decide when you're going to eat, when you're full? So it's really challenging every one of those senses. And if your body is having a hard time really efficiently interpreting that information, or is really sensitive to one of those types of information, it can make eating really difficult. So, for example, if you're really sensitive to taste, and we see a lot of our picky eaters really like those really bland foods like chicken nuggets, mac and cheese, French fries, right? But if those flavor profiles feel huge and overwhelming for your tongue, it's going to be really hard to imagine expanding out past that to fruits, to vegetables, to some of those stronger flavors, those more variable experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does this all get started? Like, this sounds like it's all in the brain for the most part. Is that right?
Yeah, I think our sensory processing is really a neurologically based system. But it's really influenced based on what our experiences are as well. If we have a lot of really positive experiences, we can rewrite those neural pathways to view things as more positive. And likewise, if we have a lot of really negative experiences, our neural pathways are going to rewire to view things more negatively. If you have, and I think this is sort of an extreme example, but for parents that maybe don't experience sensory sensitivities themselves, if you got really sick eating a food, your brain is going to remember that. And that food does not sound good for months sometimes, even if like, I just had the flu that day. It had nothing to do with that food. Or Aunt Becky made it. I know she didn't prepare it correctly. I knew if I made it, it would be fine. We still have this reluctance to eat it. And that may be based on just one negative experience. And for kids with these sensory sensitivities, they may have dozens or hundreds of negative experiences. If it made them gag, if it made them feel really sick, if it made their body feel disorganized or overwhelmed, those are all things that can play into that wiring, which is why it's important to really foster these positive experiences to make these things more manageable and comfortable for children.
What are some of the signs that, for example, maybe a mom who has an infant might see that might clue her into a sensory processing or sensory food sensitivity issue over anything else, really?
The way that I really think about it is I'm looking for trends. So when I'm talking with a family for the first time, learning about a child for the first time, the things that I want to know are, what foods does your child do really well with? What do they love? What are they seeking out? What are they asking for seconds of? And which foods are really challenging? And then we look at those two and are looking for patterns. Are all of their favorite foods a certain color? Do they have a certain smell? Are they all a certain texture? And likewise, are the foods that are challenging, are they falling into those categories as well? And as part of my book, I have on New Harbinger's website a worksheet that can help families work through this. It lists out all of your foods, and then you can go through the sensory properties of each of those foods. So you can look down the table and see, am I seeing patterns in this, or are these really smatterings all over the place?
Yeah. And do you have a link for that, Lara?
Absolutely. I can give that to you that we can put in the show notes.
Okay. That'd be awesome. Yeah. So, okay. So, and then in the toddler phase, I guess my follow-up question to that would be, when kids are toddlers, a lot of parents expect their children to be somewhat picky, right? They expect to see these food jags and food rejection and sticking with the same types of foods day in and day out. And so how would a parent really be able to, understand that maybe there's more to the story there?
That's a great question, because you're absolutely right. That is totally developmentally appropriate. Children at that age are learning to assert themselves, to form preferences, to be able to control their environment with their words and their actions. And where I start to really get concerned in that area is the questions that I have as I come to meeting a child are, is your child eating foods out of every food group, or do you feel like they're cutting off certain food groups entirely? And are they able to eat most of the time a variation of what you're making as the family meal? So maybe they're not going to eat the asparagus out of your asparagus and pasta and meat dish. But if they're eating most of it, they're participating in the meal, or are you feeling like I need to make them a separate meal really often, the majority of the time, because they're not able to participate in any of what we have going on at the table as a family? And then I would add to that, and this is maybe a less tangible example, but if feeding your child is causing a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, to me, that's a sign that there's help available, and that might be a good time to seek that out, because feeding your child should be something that's joyful and an opportunity for connection. And if you're losing that, I want you to know there's help available.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, it is supposed to be fun and joyful, and sometimes frustrating, but not all the time frustrating. And that's a good tip, that if it's all the time frustrating or most of the time frustrating, and you're very worried about your child, and you're just seeing that your child just isn't eating, then trust your gut. You're probably right?
Yeah.
So let's get into the senses, and let's walk through each of those and just talk about how that can show up in terms of children and their eating. And I think you said initially, let's talk about vision, sight, the sight of food. How does that, affect children's eating?
Absolutely. So when we think about, when we picture picky eaters, a lot of times kids will take one look at a food and be like, nope, I'm not even looking at it. I'm not touching it. I'm not trying it. I want nothing to do with it.
That would be my husband and mushrooms. Or yogurt.
Mine too. But so they're using that visual sense and maybe their smell, because the two of those sort of overlap. But in terms of the fact that we have those experiences first, but they're using that to form an immediate decision and are making an action based on that decision. And so things that children may be using are the color of the food. Sometimes kids feel comfortable with those whites and tans, those lighter colors as opposed to brightly colored foods. They may also be looking at the texture, the appearance, They may find that if there are too many foods on the plate, it's just visually overwhelming for them. They're like, I don't know where to focus. This is overwhelming. I don't want to engage in this. And so things that, if you're identifying that this is something that's impacting your child, things that I think about are limiting the volume of food that's on the plate. We can start with tiny, tiny servings and work our way up. Your child can have as many servings as they want, but may feel more comfortable to start with small servings. Research actually shows that kids, particularly younger kids, like under the age of 6 or 7, really like deconstructed meals. So the ingredients separated out rather than like a casserole in the middle, having the pasta and then the cheese and then the meat and then the veggies all separated out so that they can really use their visual sense to see what everything is, to separate it out, to figure out what it's going to look like, what it's going to be like in their mouth. Long before it ever gets to their mouth. I think
it's so funny. It's so funny because I remember as a child not liking casserole dishes, like not being able to know exact what is that grayish little triangle square thing in the middle of that casserole.
Yeah.
I remember just like, and I didn't like foods touching either. And I don't even consider myself as a picky eater. I don't really think that I was ever all that picky growing up, but I do remember not liking my foods touching and eating one food at a time. Like I could not take a bite from this food and then that food and then that food. It was like I had to eat this one first, then I moved to the next one, then I moved to the next one. And I am certain, like this is over 50 years ago. So these are tendencies that aren't brand new, right? They've been around forever.
And I think we forget as adults, we have decades of experience that we can look at a food, and even if it's something we've never had before, we have so many other experiences to draw on that we can pretty accurately say, I know what that's going to feel like in my mouth. I can probably make a guess as to what it might taste like. I can tell you just by looking at it, it's going to be crunchy, it's going to be chewy, it's going to be juicy, because we have this breadth of experience. And kids just haven't been on this planet long enough to have that same experience, and they really need to learn from just that experience. But that can make it really daunting if you're not moving forward with the same information that we might have as adults looking at the same food.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Let's talk about, you said vision and smell go together. So let's go to smell.
Yeah, so smell's another one of the ones that is one of the first things that we experience with foods, maybe even before we've seen the food, because we walk in the room and we could smell it, right? You've gotten home, mom's cooking, you can already make some guesses as to what's going to be for dinner. But for a lot of kids, that can be really overwhelming. If your nose is really sensitive and picks up just those tiniest smells, a strong smell can be, whoa, this is so much information. I feel overwhelmed. This feels really daunting. And again, if you're feeling really daunted when you get to the table, when you're sitting there with the food in front of you, that's going to make it feel really scary and really uncomfortable to dive in and take a bite. And the really nice thing about our senses of smell is we have nose blindness, right? Like our noses do eventually acclimate to smells. And the same way that like when you walk into your house, you may not notice what it smells like because you're so used to living there. But if you go on vacation for a few weeks and you come home, you're like, oh, does my house always smell like this? We can have that experience of our nose adjusting, but that takes some time. And for kids to sit sort of with that discomfort of like, this smell is really overwhelming, I'm not liking this, that can be a really difficult thing to do. And so it can be really helpful to have, again, I talk so much about setting these really positive experiences for your child. And so letting them maybe ease in slowly or be part of the cooking process. So they're there as the smells start to build versus coming in at the end when all the spices have been added and everything's at its peak. All the aromas are in the air so that they can dip their toe in the water rather than cannonballing in the pool, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or I've had some kids have a lot of success with having a really familiar scent that they can replace that overwhelming scent with. So maybe they have a favorite candle or a favorite perfume that they put on a little sweatband on their wrist. So when they get overwhelmed, okay, I can feel this is a safe smell. This is something that I have a really positive association with.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today. Yeah, that's a good idea. Now, is there a genetic propensity at all, or do you know around smell? Like just, some people like myself, I have a nose that knows. I mean, like I can smell anything everywhere. I just I have a very heightened sense of smell. Is that genetic, or is that just, are there, I don't know. I always wondered because like my husband, I think he can't smell anything at all. It's like, how can you not smell the dog? She needs a bath.
Yeah. I think that's a really great question. And I think there absolutely is a bit of a genetic component. I don't know that we have a ton of research on it, but that would make sense to me. The same with all of our neurological propensities. I think that that's one that absolutely would make sense to me. And I think there's just also so many other things that factor in there. It's our experiences as we age, the way that our sensory systems work changes. So I know really all of my senses were probably more heightened when I was a kid. My nose was a lot more sensitive. And as I age, I think that changes a little bit. Mm-hmm. We start to lose our sense of taste a little bit as we get older. And so kids are really at that peak of getting this maximum amount of information, and then maybe also with the least amount of coping strategies, because again, they haven't had the years on this planet to process through that and build those experiences.
Yeah. Okay. So what about, I think this one's interesting, sound?
Yeah, absolutely. So sound, really how I think about this with food, there's a couple of different areas. One is, what does it sound like when you're chewing your food? And this can be really important, especially for young kids as they're learning to chew their food. It gives them that extra cueing of, oh, I'm doing a good job because I can hear that crunch sound. And then for older kids, that plays in as well, too, as that sound may not be very comfortable. I think a lot of people absolutely hate the smell or the sound of hearing other people chew, right? Like that can be a really off-putting sound for a lot of people. And if you have really, really sensitive ears, a lot of the kids that I work with can hear the refrigerator kick on, can notice the fan, the air conditioner. Meal times, especially at my house, can be loud. We have pets, we're chatting, things are getting passed back and forth, utensils are getting set down on the table. And then not to mention some of those background noises. Maybe the fridge is kicking on, the heater's kicking on, a car is driving by outside. And if you have a really sensitive sense of hearing, you're picking up all of those noises, and they can be clashing and overwhelming each other to the point that it's just difficult to be in that space and can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah. I think that chewing, hearing other people eat is a big one I've seen that amongst my own children, but also amongst some of the kids I've worked with, that can be a real turnoff. And not only just like a turnoff angle on the topic, but also they gravitate towards things like crunchy. And so I don't know if that's a sound thing or if that is a texture thing. It might be both in some kids, I imagine.
Yep, absolutely. And that can certainly be hard to tease out which is which. But, if you think about if you have a crunch going on right here, that might help overwhelm the noise of Billy 2 seats down chewing his food too, and might help drown that out a little bit for you.
So you also talk about tactile as a sense.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
So that's your sense of feeling. What does food feel like? And that's for both your fingers and the inside of your mouth. And that becomes really important, thinking back to how I was talking earlier about the fact that we can look at a food and make a decision on what it's going to feel like. Kids not having that experience, a lot of times that's why, and particularly babies, they like to dive hands first in and rub it on their face and in their hair, in their ears. But what they're doing as they're doing that is they're learning, what does this food feel like? And what's it going to be like in my mouth? How am I going to have to organize it? How am I going to have to chew it? How does this carrot feel different from this cracker, feel different from this applesauce? And how is that going to play out in my mouth? But a lot of kids don't like mess on their hands or that texture in their mouth either. And so they avoid those experiences, and then they miss out on some of those learning opportunities. So now we don't really know what that texture is going to be like once it enters my mouth, because I haven't practiced mashing it up with my fingers. I'm going to take a guess, which already puts us in a bit of a unknown waters, so to speak, which can feel daunting for kids. And then also, what if they don't like the feeling of that in their mouth? We have tactile receptors on the insides of our cheeks, our tongue. We can feel the texture of our food. And if your body gets really overwhelmed with, typically I see like wet textures or slimy or chewy textures, that can feel really uncomfortable. And then where this plays in also is when we think about fruits and vegetables, because typically those are where our picky eaters have trouble, right? Is those foods can be so variable, like blueberry to blueberry. One might be large and juicy and sweet. One might be small and more firm and sour. And without the breadth of experience that we have as adults, it's really hard to make those guesses as to what it's going to be like. And so that texture or even that taste can be really surprising when it enters your mouth. And so I think that's why a lot of kids really gravitate towards like those processed foods, chicken nuggets, crackers, chips, pretzels, because those are the same every single bite. If you pick up a Cheez-It or a Goldfish, you can grab any one out of that box and it is going to be the exact same texture in your mouth, the exact same taste, the exact same bite. There's nothing unexpected that's going to come up. But if you grab a handful of blueberries or a handful of raspberries, everyone could feel a little bit different. Everyone could taste a little bit different. And if you haven't had the experience of playing with it with your hands, that's going to feel even more unexpected.
And so if we move on to the sense of taste, let's explore that, because there's flavor, right? And that's odor and taste together, right? Or odor and texture together, or I forget. You tell me. But taste, how does that play out in terms of the sensory system and picky eating?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the one that's probably the most intuitive when we think about picky eating, right? Is I don't like that. How many times have all of us heard that? And a lot of times what that comes down to is I don't like what that tastes like. And so when we think about that, I like to think about what are the flavor profiles that children are really liking. And absolutely, that's going to tie in our sense of smell and our sense of taste, because both of those combine to get sent to our brain as to what is the flavor experience of this food. And we sort of see two camps. So with all of our senses, and I talk a lot about sensitivities. So kids that get overwhelmed really easily by the amount of information that we get and how that's being processed. But we also have the opposite side of that, which is those kids that love that sensory information, that want more and more and more of it. It's never enough. And so the kids that get overwhelmed really easily, they're going to gravitate towards those really bland foods, the breads, the carbs, typically, right, is what we see. Breads, crackers, pastas, that sort of thing. And then those kids that like a ton of that information might be your flavor seekers, might be those, I really like spicy, I really like those sour foods. I know a child that likes to eat lemons, just like an orange. Really likes that strong flavor profile. And knowing your child's preferences can really help set up that experience positively for them. So if you know that your child gets overwhelmed by really strong flavors and you're making a chicken dish that has a ton of flavors in it, you might take out a little bit of chicken before you add your chili powder to it. So they can still participate in the same meal, the same as everybody else, but maybe not be so overwhelmed by the taste. And then the way I would start to introduce those stronger flavors is to give them some of that seasoning on the side. Let them control how much they want to add and start to explore that for themselves. But that way they can control that. They can, again, dip their toe in the water versus having that overwhelming cannonball experience right from the get-go. And then as we age, our tastes can change. They change because we lose the amount of taste buds we have. So we have stronger flavors can be less overwhelming. But we can also have those really positive experiences that can build on each other to form new preferences. And so to go back to my chicken example, it may be that when they're 2, they don't want any flavor on there. And then when they're 3, they'll start to sprinkle their own flavoring on there. And then by 4 or 5, they're participating in the family meal the same as everybody else because they've had a chance to build up that tolerance and those preferences and to expand the comfort zone of their body for that taste sense.
Yeah, I've certainly watched, and also obviously we haven't talked about feeding therapy or food therapy approaches, but I've watched children just with, feeding therapy alone move in the right direction in terms of, being desensitized to their sensitivities, but also accumulating positive experiences with particular foods. And that's helped them, become more confident. I think that's a big piece of it too. As kids get older, it's not only just all the sensitivities that they might be having, but then they're also in school and they have peer pressure and they've got self-esteem and they've got there's stress. There's all these other sort of psychosocial dynamics going on with these children that can really sort of feed into, so to speak, their eating.
Yeah, and that's part of what I love, but also part of what makes eating so challenging is there's just so many different factors to it. And at the end of the day, I really view eating and food as a time for connection. It's a time for connection with your friends, with your family, with your community. And when that is going wrong for whatever reason, you're not just missing out on the opportunity of eating and the nutrition that goes along with that. It's all of those opportunities for connection as well, that it's that bidirectional effect. It affects how you're eating, but also how you're eating affects all of those connections too. And that's just so important to me and part of why I'm so passionate about this area.
Yeah. Do you have trends that you notice in terms of the clientele that you take care of, in terms of diagnoses or age groupings or dynamics along the, parenting relationship? What do you notice about some of the children that you've cared for over the years in terms of similarities of characteristics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And picky eating and just eating difficulties in general is really common. It's 25 to 45% of kids, depending on which study you look at, have really significant difficulties with eating. So it is a big chunk of the population. What I've seen in my own clinical practice is more older children, especially in early teenage years, having difficulty with eating. And what I'm really attributing that to is the increased stress that we have in the last couple of years with COVID and all of the additional stressors that are being placed on young people these days. They're transitioning from virtual school to in-person school, and with that, eating at home to eating in the cafeteria to from having unlimited amount of time and maybe doing a lot of snacking. I know that's what I was doing during the height of the pandemic, to only having maybe 15, 20 minutes to get from one class to lunch to the next class. And all of those different stressors are playing in. And I'm seeing a lot more families come to me in the last couple of years with concerns about their teenagers, in addition to, I think we've always had in feeding therapy, children that are on the younger side, toddlers or babies transitioning to eating for the first time, or maybe that like 5 to 10 range of we had some early difficulties. We thought they were going to outgrow it, and they really haven't. What now? They're starting school. We need them to be participating in the family meal. We want to be able to go to holidays at grandma's. What's going on? So I think that's a very long answer to the short answer, which is I think feeding difficulties can affect all kids from all ages. And then just that personally in my own practice, I'm seeing some more older kids popping up these days too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are the kids who might have ARFID. I always say after age 6 or 7, it seems like if the eating issues are still really significant, that might be something that is going, something that's just kind of flown under the radar for years and years and hasn't been addressed. So tell me about your book. Tell the audience about your book. So, it's all about the sensory sensitivities and helping picky eaters overcome these sensitivities, right?
Yeah. So this has been a huge project, and I'm really excited to finally have it off the ground. It's going to be officially available in stores and online December 1st.
Great.
So that is coming up here in just a month, which is so exciting. And it's really born out of a desire to have more resources available for families. I was finding a few years ago, before I started this project, I had so many families asking me, what resources are there available? And they particularly wanted some from an occupational therapy perspective because I was working with them. And
Sure.
I think in the field, we have some really phenomenal information from dietitians and from speech language pathologists. And there's a couple OTs out there, but I think less than I wish there would be. And I was having a hard time finding books like this to recommend to families because we talk so much about sensory processing and our sensory systems in OT. And families were saying, I want more information. I want to be able to read some of this on my own time. So it's not just us talking during our therapy sessions. And I just didn't have a resource available that was all packaged up in one book that I could give them. It was, well, you might find some information useful out of this book and some out of this book. And this chapter is really good, but I don't know if the rest of the book's going to be helpful. And that's a frustrating answer to get as a family when you're like, I just want some help. I just need some optimism and to get to the other side of this. And so out of that feedback that I was getting, I was like, I'm going to put pen to paper and we're going to make this happen. And so it's really exciting to see it all come to fruition here a couple years later, and to have this additional resource available for families. And then also providers. I think I mentor a lot of new grads. And what I hear from new grads and what I remember feeling myself when I graduated is I didn't feel like I got enough training on feeding in school. I felt like we covered some of it. I felt like I understood development and how to evaluate and identify when things were going wrong. And then I was like, and what then? How do I help? What are those tangible strategies that I can do to help? And I felt like I knew the theory behind it and I could explain it all, but to know like in the moment, what do I do? And that's a frustrating place to be as a new clinician as well, is how do I help? And so I wanted to consolidate some of my years of experience and be able to put that in a place too that will be helpful for new grads as well as families and clinicians looking to help more families as well.
Yeah. Well, you've done a great job of, taking us through not only just the why things are happening, but what to do about it. And this book is full of different strategies and really new information, I think, to the picky eating conversation, which I thank you for that. I'm excited to see the book come out. And where can people find you, connect with you at this juncture?
Yeah, so I have social media pages, Raising Adventurous Eaters, after the title of the book, on Instagram and Facebook. I'm very easily accessible through those. And particularly now that the book is more completed, I'll be posting on those more frequently. I took a little hiatus here to get everything together for this project. And then my book itself is available wherever you enjoy purchasing books. It's on Amazon, it's at Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, wherever you enjoy purchasing books, it'll be there. And there's also more information on my publisher's website, New Harbinger, for any families that are interested in learning more about it. And that's where there's going to be some worksheets as well. I have a couple places in the book where I reference a worksheet like the one we talked about this morning of identifying if there are any patterns in your child's preferences. And all of those worksheets are available for free on New Harbinger's website. And then I'll make sure we have the link for the notes as well for today.
That will be amazing. I'll include those in the show notes, and you can see, well, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to the podcast, but you can also watch us on YouTube, have this conversation. Lara, I really appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on the Nourished Child podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast to chat with you.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.